Alright, let's get into another video, and this video is going to talk about vectors. So in the last video we talked about arrays, and one thing we can take away from arrays is that we can store multiple values in an array. Now one of the downfalls of arrays is that they are not resizable. So if we want to resize an array, it pushes us into a completely different direction, and we now have to look at something called a vector. Now what is special about using vectors is that you need to include the vector header file, given right here, and the format of using a vector looks something like this, where we have these triangle brackets right here, and then we would define our data type inside those triangle brackets. We would have our name of the vector, and then the contents of what's inside of that vector. So we could say something like the data type is integer, we can call our vector numbers, and then our vector is simply just going to be 0, 1, and 2. Now, similar to arrays, we start with the 0th element, and that corresponds to the index of the vector. So if we said numbers 0, it would map to 0. And notice here, we use the square brackets, similar to arrays. Now, including this vector header file allows us to access some quick tricks. So we can use this dot front and this dot back, and that will give the 0th element and the last element. And how we insert that is we would have our vector, so numbers, would have dot back, and that would map to the value of 2 in our initial vector that we defined up here. Now we're not just limited to the front and back indices, we can actually access any specific index, and with that we just use the dot at the end of that vector. So if we had something like numbers dot at, and then we fill in the parentheses this time because this is the index we're looking for. And you can also use these square brackets here, but in later videos we'll see that this dot at, it allows us to see errors. So we have a similar procedure that we used for arrays, but now we can use it to change elements in the vector. But we can also use, again, that dot at. So we could say the numbers dot at, and then 1. That's going to be equal 6, and that will give us this vector up here. So either method. But the reason that we are bringing up vectors is because we have the ability to resize them. Now the way that we resize them, it's a little bit limited. So we have two options here. We have dot pushback and dot popback. So pushback will add an element to the end of that vector, and popback removes an element from the end. And because of this availability to resize, we also get a neat little trick. We don't need to define the size of the vector or the elements in it. So we can actually just have a line of code that looks like this right here. Except we would fill in the data type and whatever name we want to call that vector, and then we can just start adding elements to it. Now if you're coming from the last video, you might remember the extra steps that you had to use to find the number of elements inside of an array. And because we get to use that nice vector header file, we don't have to deal with that nonsense. Instead, we can just use this dot size with the parentheses here, and that will give us the number of elements in a vector. So kind of all of this is the uniqueness that really defines a vector from an array. But these are not the only choices you have for storing multiple values. So we can actually have something else called lists. And if we look into a list, it's kind of similar to a vector, except we kind of get one downfall, it seems, and we can't isolate a specific index. So again, we are including a unique header file. Our list formatting, if we want to define one, looks like this. But there is one thing that kind of sucks, and we can only manipulate the front and back values. But we get the trade-off that we can add elements in the front or back. With vectors, we could only add it at the back or remove it from the back. So for adding elements, you would have this dot push front or dot push back. And for removing, you would have dot pop front and dot pop back. Again, we get a similar size command. And if you start to compare this with vectors, off the face value, the only real benefit that you get is that you can add things in front of all of the indices. But that comes with the limitation that you can't isolate a specific index that we talked about up here, aside from the front and back values. So maybe you're asking, well, why should I even use a list? And this is maybe a little bit abstract, but if you have a number of things inside of an array, a list, or a vector, and let's say you don't need to access the specific index besides the front and the back position, well, then maybe a list is your best option. Now we have even more options. We can have something called a stack. We have to introduce this concept of last in, first out. So the stack works on this concept of whatever the last thing that you added in, that will be the first thing that you have to take out. And this is as far as we really need to think about these right now, because we're going to jump into Visual Studio and we're going to look at some code involving vectors. So the basis of this code is that we're going to create a vector by inputting numbers. And this code is going to continuously ask you to input a single digit number. And it's also going to give you an option for stopping the request for that single digit number. And then at the end, it will display that vector that you made, and it will tell you the size of that vector. So we know we're going to have some inputs and outputs. So we include this header file. Because we're working with vectors, we include that vector header file. And inside the main, we just define an integer as input. And then we just define our vector here. Notice we're not saying the size of that vector or any of the elements. And after we establish what needs to be defined, we're simply output enter a single digit number to store in a vector. And then in parentheses, we have our condition for what you can enter to terminate this vector. So scrolling down a little bit, we have our familiar do while loop. Now inside this loop, we're simply going to request to enter the single digit number. We're going to take some input that gets stored right here, which we previously defined. And then we're going to do some checks about what that input is. So we're just using an if-else statement. So the first thing that we can check is if we've met that termination condition right here. And if we did, we're just going to break out of this do while loop. Otherwise, if we did not meet that condition, we're going to use that pushback feature that we previously saw on the whiteboard. And the value that we're going to assign at the end of the vector is just going to be that input value, which we got from the input that you would enter in. And because we didn't define the size of the vector, it's just going to throw this into the 0th element. And then this continuously loops because we have while true. The only way we really get out of this do while loop is if we enter this termination condition. And if we meet that termination condition and we break out after we enter a series of numbers, then we're just going to output, this is the vector you created. And now we're going to use this for each loop, which we talked about in the previous video. So this is going to cycle through each element inside of the numbers vector. And then we're simply just going to output that element. And then after we output each element and we close off the bracket on that vector, we're simply just going to say that the vector you created has some number of elements. And this is where we use that size feature. So this will give us the number of elements that we have. So if we run this code, and then the terminal asks for the single digit number, so we can say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And let's say we're happy with our vector here, so we enter that termination condition. And then the terminal will output, this is the vector you created, so our 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 vector. And the vector we created, it has 5 elements. So now we can clear the terminal just by typing in clear. And actually we can close that terminal for now because we can modify this code a little bit. So what we could do is actually make this do while loop just a while loop. So if we run that code again and just enter a new vector with our while loop, and then we terminate that, you can see that we get the same functionality that we had with the do while loop. And in addition to changing the do while loop to simply a while loop, perhaps instead of having a termination condition, you just terminate if the user enters some double-digit value. So we've changed our if statement check right here. So instead of checking for a certain value, we just say if that is greater or equal to 10, because that would be some double-digit value, even triple digits. So that would violate our rules right here. We can enter some more numbers. And you can see here, once we entered that double-digit number, well, we didn't follow the rules and we broke out. And this is the vector that we created. Now, this should do it for this video. In the next video, we're going to talk about something different from vectors and arrays, and it's going to be about data types and pointers. If you learned anything new, please like, comment, share, subscribe. Helps the YouTube algorithm. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.